So I think that easy gore is like it's the easiest thing to pull off, and it's the least interesting thing.
Hello, everyone. I'm here again with another episode for Area 43, and today I have with me Ted Nicolaou. He is the responsible for some very, cult movies that we have for horror since the 80s, like Terrorvision and Subspecies. So thank you so much, Ted, for accepting this.
Hey, thank you, Alessandro. Yeah, it's fun to be here.
A lot of people say that in the 80s were the golden age of horror, and that's when we started. So do you agree with that? Was that really the golden age?
I think the 80s, the benefit for horror movies in the 80s was that they were still the territory of independent productions and small producers, and uh, were limited in their budgets. So there was a lot of freedom for filmmakers. And somewhere in the 80s, I think the studios uh, became aware of the fact that there was a lot of money to be made in horror films. And so they started making horror films, which kind of wiped out the smaller production companies because it was hard to compete with movies with such big budgets. But I think because of the independence of the 80s and the fact that it was pre-CG technology, and so everything had to be kind of made by hand, I think it benefited the world of horror movies.
That's something I wanted to ask you because that is pretty much just had the practical effects, and then how was the process that you use for creating the monsters and creatures? Do you miss that approach that's more like handcrafting, or how do you feel about it?
I think it's still in existence, and there are still plenty of makeup effects artists and sculptors and people who fabricate creatures and makeup effects. So for me, I don't, that hasn't really gone away. I think what's gone away is kind of or what has added on to the picture is the ability to create worlds and to create full-scale monsters that kind of defy the physics of the human body or puppeteering. But it's still a matter of when you make a vampire movie or when you make a horror film, you still have to describe in words kind of what it is you're looking for, and then artists and sculptors kind of answer you with sketches, and you gradually kind of narrow it down to what works and what you really want to have happen for the movie, and then they go to work, and it's really in the magic of the sculptors and their ability to create something, either whether it's a prosthetic makeup effect or a creature effect that has to be rod puppeted, or however it's going to become animated. The I think that still remains, and that's still part of the process of making films.
But then when you look at Terrorvision, it was really cool to see that huge monster, and he was very friendly sometimes. And this movie and even Subspecies is, those are still, the fans are really passionate about them till now. Do you have any memories of the production, or any stories on for the background of making those movies that you you like to talk about, that's fun to remember?
Terrorvision was really my first feature, and I was able to make it like I imagined it, like a comedy monster movie, for better or for worse. I don't know. It kind of failed in its initial release, and it's only in later years that it that it seemed to have become popular from kids passing it on to their friends or seeing it on TV. But the creation of the Hungry Beast for Terrorvision was a real process, because I had been an editor for Charles Band before I had the chance to direct Terrorvision, and I knew very well the makeup effects of John Beekler and his team of artists, and I knew kind of their strengths and I knew their weaknesses, and one of the things that you have to be aware of when you're dealing with puppets is they go through a lot of motions, and in editing you have to pick the short little pieces of their action that kind of reads as having some internal life. with the monster for Terrorvision, I asked John Beekler to create something that was like both lovable and horrifying and stupid looking and asymmetrical and able to be kind of a lovable pet, but also, just be something that you've never seen on Earth. And we went back and forth quite a bit, because what I was asking for was something that he had never done before and wasn't in total agreement with. But eventually, through the help of his, some of the artists that worked on his team who kind of understood, we arrived at the Hungry Beast look, which was basically very asymmetrical, one tentacle, one pincer arm, and all the little flappy things around the bottom that kind of concealed the wheels that had to move him about. The challenge with that character was it required like sometimes up to 5 people operating it in a very small space, and he couldn't really move around very much. And it was hot on the soundstage where we shot in Italy. There was no air conditioning, so the people inside the monster's body were dying from the heat. So we had to make some accommodations and basically bring a big air conditioning unit from the airport to keep them cool. But somehow, even for the actors and for me, when directing the Hungry Beast, looking into his mouth where I could kind of see the faces of the people operating, and you felt like you were speaking to a character, and that's kind of the magic of practical effects.
Yeah, and then nowadays, like the horror passed through a lot of transformation. Like since the 80s to now. How do you see this transformation? Because you lived all of that from the 80s till now. How do you see horror evolving?
I think in a way, horror has evolved and is less interesting in some ways now than it was then. And I think it has more to do with the literacy of people who are writing horror. I think even back in the 80s, there were writers like Dennis Paoli, who worked with Stuart Gordon, people who were very literate and understood structuring of stories. And I think, for myself, I was sort of taught in film school. We kind of went through the entire history of cinema and studied the various, like neorealism, surrealism, and expressionism, understood kind of all the genres of filmmaking. And so, my favorite films are, kind of harken back to the 40s and 50s and 60s. And I think now filmmakers, sort of like when they think of classic films, they're thinking Jaws, and not quite understanding or appreciating kind of the entire history of cinema. So I don't want to sound like a grumpy old man or anything, but I feel like we're missing something, or maybe we've plumbed kind of every possible situation and storyline and theme of horror, and now we're just kind of searching for what makes a little bit of difference.
Yes, I agree. To be honest with you, I don't have a lot of references from the 40s and 50s, but I actually started I watched a lot of movies from the 70s on, and 70s and 80s are my favorite, space and time for horror. That's where are the movies that I like the most, for sure. And now we do have another sub genres, I would say, like found footage and psychological horror. And and what do you think about this new tendency? Just one thing to compliment. I think that the first found footage I heard of was the McPherson tape from 1986, I believe, or 89, about aliens and all of that. But that was just one movie, and now we have a lot of them. So how do you see those new subgenres?
I think the subgenres really benefit horror films. You know, found footage films are really difficult to pull off, but if you can pull them off, they lend a sense of immediacy to what you're watching, and a sense of it really happening. So I think the more we explore kind of the subgenres of horror films and different ways of telling horror stories, it you know, there'll be some failures and there'll be some great successes in terms of what they achieve, and I'm all for it. I think the blend of cinema and self-aware cinema and you know, it's all about telling a story with actors and locations, but the way that you use the camera just keeps it more interesting.
Is it harder to scare the audience these days?
I mean, I think the audience has seen every kind of shock scare that they can experience. I mean, I still jump at movies when there's a shock, uh, and I guess that's just a, you know, like a physical reaction that we have. Um, I think for me, horror films should be more about kind of a sense of awe and a sense of like confrontation with the other and with forces that are beyond our understanding. Um, and for me, that's the best kind of horror film. So uh, a matter of scaring audiences has to be a combination of the situation, your sense of identification with the characters in the film that you want to survive the confrontation, and the skill of the filmmaker in kind of making you believe what you're seeing.
Yeah, let me ask you, because even though I really prefer the movies from the 70s and 80s, I think that the stories back then were more scarier than the stories now. Now it's, you know, it looks like a lot of movies are just focusing on giving you jump scares and all of that, and not so much about the story itself. But at the same time, when I look at movies today, like The Exorcist, which is one of my favorite movies, I really can't be. I don't get scared by the special effects they used or anything like that. And was it back then? Do you think that level of effects was really enough for scaring people, or I don't know? I just think that when you look back, it doesn't. I mean, it doesn't look that scary.
You know, I think there was a greater sense of innocence in the audience back then, because coming out of the 50s with the kind of like a nuclear atomic era monsters, you know, formed from radiation, into the 60s where it started to be like psycho and psycho killing movies, uh, to the 70s with Tobe Hooper's Chainsaw Massacre. It was possible to come up with a new idea and terrify audiences with a story, you know. And the 70s were really like probably the peak of Hollywood filmmaking too, in terms of the independent young filmmakers who were finally given a chance to kind of make the movies that they wanted to make. So yeah, I think it's a combination of the innocence of the 60s and 70s and the overabundance now of, you know, we've seen Texas Chainsaw Massacre. We've seen like 6 iterations of Texas Chainsaw Massacre. We've seen Psycho plus a million other psycho killing movies. We've seen torture porn, which is like probably my least favorite of all the genres of horror. Um, and you know what's left to surprise us? You know, we've seen a million alien invasion movies, and so to keep mining horror, you sort of need to find new insecurities in our society to kind of dig into the cracks of. And so I think it becomes harder and harder to scare audiences these days.
Yeah, and since you mentioned back in the 80s, there's a lot of movies that would explore the Cold War and all of this nuclear paranoia and all of that. How did these two elements influence, the stories back then and its characters?
I think the Cold War and the threat of nuclear annihilation led to just a number of movies, like the Attack of the 50-Foot Woman, or the like the Amazing Colossal Man, like Mole People, and I think hand in hand with the threat of nuclear extinction and the Cold War was the belief in flying saucers and UFOs, and so all of those two things, the threat of atomic bombs and the fear of being watched over by some alien civilizations, I think really fed a lot of movies throughout the 50s into the 60s, and even to today. It's still a part of the kind of dictionary of possible frightening scenarios.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And then you talked about all of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and then the Psycho movies, and that reminded me that today we do have a lot of remakes and reboots and people trying to extract the juice from the same source. But does it reflect maybe the lack of ideas on creating something new, or why is that so much? Why people try so much to try to take things out of what has already been gone?
I think there's two things working. One is greed. And in my opinion, greed is kind of like one of the greatest dangers to society, from government greed to corporate greed. And I think studios, they see that, okay, if we make a movie based on some unknown idea, it's a gamble. Maybe it'll turn a profit, and maybe not. But if we make a movie that's based on something that all the young teenagers in the audience know, it's guaranteed to make money. So there's greed at work, and I think there's really a lack of vision, and I don't think it's a lack of vision in people who are writing screenplays and people who want to make movies, because I think there's kind of the artists of filmmaking, and they always have something that they want to say. But there's the filter of the people with money who kind of allow certain filmmakers to come to the surface and keep others in the dark. And I think that's, and I think the lack of vision is really in the people with who are holding the money in their hands. And that's just a part of making movies. The hardest thing is to find the money to make your film.
Yeah, and I don't know if people are naive these days, but now there's this everything around this Terrifier movie, and everyone talking about Art the Clown and how much gore there is in these movies. But then I come back to let's go way back. I could talk about Hostel and some more recent movies like The Human Centipede, but let's go back and talk about Necromantic, like from the 70s. I think that's one of the movies that breaks all of the barriers and cross all the limits, all the lines, and in terms of gore. Do you think that when they try to claim that today's productions are more extreme than the ones in the past, I just think that it's nonsense. What do you think about it?
I think I don't know Necromantic, actually. I'm sorry to say, but I think that for me, gore is the least interesting part of a horror film. And to me, what's interesting is the confrontation with something that's evil, that's more powerful than we are. And the gore is just kind of the byproduct of that. And I think in a movie like Terrifier, where the gore becomes kind of the bath that you're kind of like splashed with throughout, it sort of feels to me like it's a degradation of our humanity and our ability to follow a story and empathize with characters that are like in a situation that thank God we are not confronted by. So I think that easy gore is like it's the easiest thing to pull off, and it's the least interesting thing. And for me, um, movies, even like any movies that kind of deal with man's inhumanity to man, and torture and uh, uh, dismemberment and all of that seem they're not my thing very much. I prefer a monster to tear a person apart than for a person to chop somebody up with an axe. So um, for me, I guess the main appeal of horror is in that sense of awe that you get from the confrontation with evil. And I'm speaking from a perspective of somebody who has, uh, I think all of my movies kind of identify more with the monster than with the humans. Terrorvision for
Mhm.
sure. Even Subspecies is a story set in the vampire world, and the very first Subspecies, yes, there are these human students who are threatened by the vampire, but very quickly the series evolved into the story of a vampire and his consort who is kind of struggling against her transformation into a vampire. So I guess I find monsters more interesting, in the long run.
Yeah, no, I see your point, and to be honest with you, I think the stories behind those movies are actually better. But and how does the horror involving religion fits in? Like you get the Omen, Exorcist, and all of the variants that you get. How do you fit that between humans and monsters?
I think religion is interesting for horror films because it gives you kind of a foundational structure of supernatural beings. I'm not a religious person myself, and I don't. When I watch The Exorcist, the the I can understand how a person who's very Catholic maybe feels the horror on a deeper level and the sense of hell and demons and all of that. For me, I guess, when you think about horror and the evil beings that kind of inhabit the earth and our imaginations, the religion serves as a really great kind of oppositional morality to the monsters. So I think it's an important part of it.
Oh yeah, I agree. I like this kind of movies. I'm not religious myself as well, but I think it gives a lot of room for something that is in between. Like because it's not a man, but it's not at the same time a monster that that is obviously fiction. It can, for those who believe that evil can actually exist, right? And then if you I need to ask you, are you working on something new? Do you still have plans on launching a continuation for Subspecies, or something else?
Yeah, I have always plans, and when I'm not actually working for money, I'm here at home writing screenplays. And yeah, I'm working on something right now that I'm hoping to do. That's kind of the story of a rock and roll band's last night on Earth. And it's always a matter of finding a few people to be my allies to kind of help push the movie toward money or push money toward the movie. I've got another script that I'm about to start writing that I'm hoping I could get Anna Sove to work again in maybe Serbia again, because I really loved shooting subspecies number 5 in Serbia. And an actress there, Stasha, who played Ariel in subspecies 5. We're trying to find a story that would work for Annas and her to work together again. So yeah, I'm always working on something. I've got a lot of scripts that never got made, like every other writer, but I have
That's so
hope.
cool. No, that's so cool. Up to now, what do you think is your best legacy for the horror cinema?
My best legacy?
Sorry, your biggest legacy.
My biggest legacy, I guess it would have to be the Subspecies films, because they seem to have a following around the world. I'm not sure how many thousands of people that may be, but the people who love those films really love them. You know, I have no illusions. I think my films are all kind of limited by the budgets and by the schedules that we had to shoot them under, and they're all flawed in many, many ways. But I think the power of kind of the performances, the power of the imagery, the stories themselves, and I think really kind of helps to overcome or helps people to forgive the flaws and see kind of what we intended to do. I've been very lucky to be able to shoot the Subspecies films in Romania, in Transylvania, in authentic castles and churches and monasteries and locations that would cost so much money here in the States and are not even available here in the States, and probably not even available in Romania anymore for what we were able to do in them. So the places where we shot them and the difficult circumstances under which those films were made really enhanced the quality of those movies, and Anna Sove's performance and Denise Duff's performance and Jan Hajduk's performance and the characters and the situation and the locations and the cinematography by Vlad Paunescu and the incredible costumes by Oana Paunescu really elevated those movies beyond the meager budgets that they were made for. So I think Subspecies, my big legacy, Terrorvision, my kind of personal baby of a movie, because it was sort of born into a world that didn't appreciate it at all, and over the years kind of like proved that it has something there that appeals to audiences. So for me, I also love Terrorvision just as much as I love the Subspecies films.
Oh yeah, I love that too. I was like, I don't know, 8 or 9 when I watched it the first time, and I remember the scene where the kid gets to the bedroom, the adults are all under the sheets, and then it's the monster. Man, I couldn't sleep for like 5 days.
Oh, sorry, man.
But
That was too young. You
it
know
was
what, though?
just great. Yeah, go ahead.
When I set out to write that script, I wanted it to be the kind of movie that kids would see on television and it would haunt them in a way, because it's like something that unlike anything that you've seen, and for me, a movie that haunted my childhood was a movie called Invaders from Mars, the original one, about a little boy who's out his window, he sees a flying saucer crash, and pretty soon his parents and teachers and everybody has kind of been implanted with these devices that make them subservient to the aliens. And it was that movie, when I saw it, because it had like a very expressionistic kind of production design, really haunted me. And I hoped that Terrorvision would kind of have that same effect, and obviously
Oh, we did.
it succeeded.
Yeah, and it was like, I don't know, maybe 5 years ago. I remember about that, and I was like, what was the name of that movie? So I started Googling until I could find it and watch it again. And it was like, I have to thank you, because it really gave me a lot of emotional memories that were so important to me. So thank you. That was a huge part of contributed a lot on my love for horror these days.
Oh, cool. Okay, that's good, man.
And like, I have a last question for you. What advice would you give for young filmmakers that are just starting on horror? You know, is there anything that you would tell them?
Yeah, I think now the possibility to make your own movie is much more available to everybody, and any young horror fan who has a vision for a horror movie can do it. You know, you need some friends, you need some actors, a place to shoot it, some money to feed people, but you can, you know, with the love and kind of assistance of the people that you're working with, you can make a horror film. So I would say the thing to do is to start with a short idea, you know, and make a 5-10 minute little horror story, and hone your craft that way, because it's not only about camera placement and locations and production design. A lot of it has to do with editing, because in the editing process, you can fix a lot of mistakes that you made. You learn a lot about performance and about what camera angles you need to make a film work. So simultaneously with making your short, you're also learning editing. And I started out to be a director, but I worked for a number of years as an editor, and that experience really really benefited me in terms of how I approach a day's worth of shooting.
Oh, that's great. Well, thanks so much for talking to me today. It was a pleasure, a privilege being here with you. So thank you.
Okay, thanks a lot, Alessandro, and good luck.